Part 1. The Strategic Context of Deception in World War II. Why deceiving the enemy became a system, not an episode. World War II was not merely a duel of steel, tonnage, and horsepower. It was also a duel of perception, a duel of illusions, a duel of deliberately engineered misunderstanding. The United States, Germany, Britain, and Japan did not only fight with high-explosive shells, armor-piercing rounds, or torpedoes fueled by hydrogen peroxide. They also fought with maps that were not true, with radio transmissions that were never intended to be heard by their own side, with dummy units made of plywood, rubber, and paint, with radar echoes that had no mass, with convoys that were illusions, with documents that were planted in the hope they would be stolen, and above all, with a constant, systematic intention to force the enemy to make the wrong decision before actual fire was exchanged. This is the hardest part to explain for viewers who grew up in a post-Cold War world, where deception is something associated primarily with intelligence agencies, misinformation, or social media manipulation. In the 1940s, deception was a structural, industrial, mass-manufactured tool, as real as the production of aircraft carriers. The U.S. alone in 1944 employed entire battalions whose only purpose was to lie to the enemy. Not poetically lie, not metaphorically lie, but literally generate misleading acoustic signatures, fake tank tracks, false encoded signals, or deceptive radar reflections. These units were not side actors. They were frontline tools of operational art, and they were deployed precisely because war at the scale of the 1940s reached a complexity where firepower was not enough. Information became the true multiplier. If one regiment could force another regiment to concentrate in the wrong valley simply by planting misleading radio chatter, the result was equivalent to destroying that regiment with artillery without firing a gun. The concept became particularly systematic in the Western Allied camp. American doctrine internalized deception not as improvisation, but as a repeatable procedure. There were manuals, there were tables, there were training modules. In some cases, there were budget lines. American deception work became a kind of industrial craft, an assembly line of illusions with predictable phases, reconnaissance of what the enemy believes, insertion of misleading indicators, reinforcement of misleading indicators, then exploitation of the enemy's decision. This is a crucial distinction. Deception does not exist to fool the enemy once. It exists to make him act on a false belief. A false belief is only useful if it translates into logistics, movement, ship deployment, ammunition allocation, aircraft transfer. A false belief that does not cause physical displacement is sterile. The most effective American deception operations forced the German command to send tanks to the wrong theater, submarines to the wrong grid square, or flak units to the wrong approach vector. Every mile burned in diesel or gasoline by German engines due to misallocation was a systemic victory. The U.S. was uniquely capable of scaling deception because the U.S. had the industrial capacity to give illusions physical form. This part is often forgotten. British deception pre-1943 was mostly intellectual. British illusion was clever paper, but American illusion was hardware. Sound trucks weighing several tons, rubber Shermans inflated with compressed air, full-size amphibious craft mock-ups made in assembly yards. These illusions were real objects that consumed steel, rubber, gasoline, and maintained their existence through logistics. An American deception battalion could move 500 tons of fake armored equipment across France and leave tank tracks in mud using special rollers. This required not just creativity, but a production culture capable of mass. The reason deception became systematic was because the U.S. had a strategic asymmetry. It could afford to multiply its own force perception cheaply. A real Sherman tank cost about $33,500 in 1944 terms. A fake rubber Sherman cost about $300. That ratio, roughly 100 to 1, meant that for the cost of one real tank, you could deploy the ghost of 100 tanks. The enemy had to react to the ghost if he could not distinguish the two. You forced the German side to spend real ammunition, real fuel, real manpower, real reconnaissance flights to verify shadows. It was asymmetric economics.
You were forcing the enemy to detect a fake that cost you little to produce, but cost him much to confirm. This is why deception in WW2 is not merely a curious anecdotal domain for historians. It is an expression of modern industrial warfare. The more resources a nation had, the more it could distort the perception of those resources. The U.S. Navy, for example, in 1944, engaged in systematic convoy multiplication. Some convoys did not exist. Some existed, but were mirrored by fake radio nets. Some radio nets were real, but were labeled as belonging to non-existent ships. This meant that to the Kriegsmarine, which only had about 60 operational U-boats in the western approaches at any one time, the ocean seemed more crowded than it was. In intelligence terms, this created a false density map. A captain who saw a pattern of Allied traffic in one grid square might suspect a trap, even if there was none, because the U.S. had used radio nets to artificially amplify signature density. This distortion caused hesitation, and hesitation is death in patrol warfare. Psychology is central here. A U-boat captain alone in the Atlantic at night sees a trace on the hydrophone that could be a 5-ship convoy, or it could be a sound decoy. If he hesitates 60 seconds while debating the meaning of the trace, he loses firing position. The U.S. Navy understood that the mental state of the enemy was an operational variable. This is the difference between pre-WW1 naval warfare and WW2. In 1914, a navy fought ships. In 1943, a navy fought the minds of ship captains. A similar example applies to German heavy armor. A Tiger tank might appear invincible to infantry, but the Tiger had operational weaknesses. The Tiger needed ammunition trucks and fuel trucks. The Tiger's tactical flexibility was extremely limited by fuel load. A Tiger I in cross-country operations drank up to 430 liters per 100 kilometers. Therefore, if you could produce a false threat vector, a phantom tank battalion, you could drag a Tiger company dozens of kilometers off the decisive axis and waste 5 tons of gasoline to chase a ghost. That gasoline was more valuable than the tank. German industry could not produce enough fuel. American deception, therefore, was not just about tricking minds. It was about consuming Axis fuel. The deeper you analyze WW2, the more you notice that deception is essentially logistics manipulation by information. A fake tank unit is not a fake because it does not have steel armor. It is real because the enemy reacts to it. A deception operation succeeds only if it burns enemy fuel, enemy time, enemy engineer hours, enemy staff attention. Deception is not a decoration. It is not a theatrical performance. It is a way of converting imagination into physical enemy damage. And the cost of that damage is near zero compared to the cost of actual kinetic combat. This explains why American deception became explicitly industrialized in the period 1943 to 1945. By mid-war, the U.S. had confidence in victory, but to accelerate victory, the U.S. needed to compress German decision-making time, to stress an enemy under economic compression. Every false alarm the U.S. generated forced the German staff system to adapt under stress, and stressed systems produce errors. German operational staff had capacity for only a finite number of cycles per day. If you increase the number of false events they must respond to, you reduce the cognitive energy available for detecting real events. By 1944, German staff work was essentially drowning in noise. Part 2. The Submarine Trap: How American Destroyers Caught a German U-Boat Disguised as a Civilian Freighter. Therefore, deception in WW2 is not an anecdote, it is a strategic lever. In the mid-Atlantic, where the ocean turns metallic and the horizon becomes a straight geometry of steel blue line and pure empty space, the Second World War became an invisible duel. There were no trenches, there were no city ruins. There was only a massive surface area of water, a chessboard without a grid, and on that board, the most lethal pieces were almost always unseen. The submarine war between the United States Navy and the Kriegsmarine was a war inside uncertainty itself. It was a war where the majority of combat was not shooting, but listening. It was a war where a periscope rising 2 inches above a wave could rewrite logistics, economics, and strategic resource allocation. In 1942 and 1943, German U-boats were still dangerous, even after British code breaking started to degrade the impact of Wolfpack coordination. The war in the Atlantic was not static. Technology moved, tactics evolved. Every side constantly tried to hack the opponent's expectations. The Germans experimented with sneaker disguises, configurations where a U-boat on the surface would imitate the silhouette of a small neutral freighter. This was not fantasy, it was field-tested. A U-boat on the surface could mask its deck gun, hide the conning tower shape with canvas, adjust running lights, and at night appear, from certain angles, to be a slow merchant vessel. Most people today imagine U-boats always submerged. That is wrong. A submarine of that era was not a fully submersible war machine. It was primarily a surface diesel-electric craft that dipped only when it needed to attack or escape. Cruising submerged was inefficient because batteries were limited. Diesel engines only ran on the surface where oxygen was available. Therefore, most transits were done surfaced, and on the surface, you could mislead. A freighter look-alike was an operational idea. If you can convince the enemy that you are a harmless merchant, maybe a destroyer will not go to general quarters. Maybe an escort will relax acoustic vigilance. Maybe a convoy will not panic. Deception here was not a trick. It was a fuel multiplier. If you could avoid diving repeatedly, you would save battery cycles and diesel. A U-boat commander who could reduce unnecessary evasive dives might extend his patrol by 2 days. 2 days was operational treasure. Every hour mattered. The Germans pursued the tactic, but the Americans did not remain passive. The American destroyer forces in 1943-1944 included some of the most inventive anti-submarine tacticians in naval history. They understood the psychology of the U-boat commander. They studied it. They reverse-engineered the thought process. They asked, when does a German captain feel compelled to dive? When does he feel confident enough to stay surfaced? How do we manipulate that feeling? The Americans realized something subtle. The Germans felt safe staying on the surface when they believed they were either invisible or mistaken for something else. This is where deception flips direction, where the U.S. uses the German deception against the German. If the German wants to appear like a merchant to lure a destroyer into carelessness, what if the destroyer pretends to be careless deliberately in order to lure the disguised submarine even closer until the kill zone becomes absolute? This is where the story becomes an intellectual ambush. And this is exactly what happened on several U.S. Navy destroyer patrols. One particularly illustrative engagement involved a U.S. destroyer trio acting like incompetent amateurs, not in reality, but in the deliberate theater of anti-submarine warfare. The trio of destroyers in this specific case study deliberately communicated on open radio in plain English, statements implying they could not classify a contact correctly. They transmitted, possibly coastal tramp steamer, might be Portuguese. They allowed the enemy to listen. That radio traffic was staged. It was not naive confusion. It was bait. The German submarine, disguised as a neutral-ish coastal freighter, believed the deception was working. The U-boat's command assumed, the Americans think we are civilian. They are not going to perform a depth charge attack. This combination of arrogance and false confidence is the psychological kill vector. German tactical manuals warned against underestimating Americans, but war fatigue and long months at sea made caution degrade. Human decision-making rust. The Germans had long claimed Americans lacked subtlety. That stereotype became their vulnerability. The U.S. destroyers then executed the second part of the trap. They turned away slowly, as if uninterested, not fully withdrawing, just giving the impression of disengagement. The disguised U-boat maintained its surface course, because diving at that moment would reveal it was not civilian. The commander held to the disguise. He felt invested in it. This emotional sunk cost is crucial. When a deception has worked, the deceiver becomes attached to it. The U.S. destroyers knew this dynamic. They exploited it. The destroyers then deployed sound traps, acoustic noisemakers, to simulate propeller signatures of escort ships moving in a different direction, away from the U-boat. The Germans assumed they now had total environmental cover. They believed the Americans were leaving the area. But in reality, the destroyers were actually triangulating. They were building a firing geometry. They were shaping the field of engagement into a closed pocket. Then the third layer came: sonar drip pulses, ultra-low amplitude sweeps that were not strong enough to trigger defensive diving reflex in the U-boat, but just strong enough for the destroyer's own pattern matching algorithms. This is a subtlety that today's viewer might miss. In 1943, the U.S. Navy's sonar signal processing was already making statistical interpretations, not digital computers, but analog pattern recognition performed by trained operators, humans, as real-time filters. They could detect slight anomalies in the echo pattern of a hull disguised under a canvas structure. A fake freighter silhouette can fool binoculars, but sonar does not care about silhouette. Hull shape and water displacement are acoustic signatures, and those signatures betray what the human eye cannot see. Once the exact position of the target was fixed within a few dozen yards, the destroyers accelerated, hard, without warning, directly toward the contact. The U-boat commander was suddenly forced into a corner. He had only seconds to decide: dive or try to run. But diving when a destroyer is already only 1,500, 2,000 yards away is almost always fatal. A destroyer at flank speed closes distance too fast. The U-boat hesitated because it was emotionally invested in the disguise. This is the psychological paradox. Deception works best when the deceiver believes it. His own illusion traps him. The destroyers released a depth charge pattern pre-calculated not for a submerged target, but for a target that is in the first moments of a crash dive, which means the boat is still shallow, still adjusting ballast, and in the worst possible condition to absorb concussive pressure waves. Depth charges are not bombs, they are pressure devices. When they explode near a submarine hull, the water itself becomes the hammer. At shallow depth, the wave rebound off the surface creates complex reflection patterns that can deform the hull more violently than deeper detonations. The U-boat was hit before it could reach safe depth. Several crew compartments flooded instantly. The pressure hull deformed. The boat became uncontrollable. The Germans tried to blow ballast and surface, but the destroyers anticipated that maneuver. They had already adjusted gun crews to fire on a surfacing submarine, the moment when the U-boat is at maximum vulnerability, stuck between two mediums, neither fully submerged nor fully surfaced, unable to maneuver. The U-boat broke surface crooked, at an angle, clearly crippled. The Americans opened fire with 5-inch guns and anti-aircraft secondaries. The engagement ended within minutes. Survivors were recovered. And after interrogation, the Americans learned something important. The German commander was absolutely convinced the disguise had worked until the moment of catastrophe. He never realized he was the one being manipulated. This is the core of the case study. Deception in anti-submarine warfare is not just about hiding yourself. It is about encouraging the enemy to misinterpret you. The U.S. destroyers pretended to be fooled in order to fool the deceiver. The Americans learned over time that fighting U-boats was less about raw firepower and more about understanding the adversary's thought process. A U-boat hull is steel, but the decisions inside the steel hull are human. Human decisions can be steered. Human confidence can be weaponized against its owner.
This is why this engagement is conceptually important. It demonstrates that the U.S. Navy in the Mid-Atlantic theater was not just a blunt hammer, it was a cognitive operator. It could treat the German submarine force as a psychological system, and if you can understand what your enemy wants to believe, you can weaponize that belief. The disguised U-boat wanted to believe it was fooling the enemy. That desire became the bait. Modern analysts sometimes underestimate how sophisticated this was. They think deception is just camouflage, but the Americans were doing multi-layer cognitive exploitation. They used false radio chatter, false acoustic signatures, and a staged performance of incompetence. They acted, literally acted, like naive observers, and that acting was the decisive instrument. This single duel reflects a much broader truth. The U.S. victory in the Atlantic was not just the result of more ships, more destroyers, more sonar sets, or more convoy escorts. It was also the victory of a force that could weaponize perception. Part 3. The bait tank. How American forces lured a tiger out of cover to kill it. The logic of tactical temptation. The German Tiger tank, with its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun, quickly became a symbol of battlefield dominance in the early years of World War II. In many ways, it was both a technological marvel and a tactical enigma. Allied forces faced a dilemma. Engaging a tiger head-on was often suicidal, yet leaving it unchallenged meant allowing it to disrupt infantry advances, destroy softer vehicles, and create a psychological nightmare among soldiers. The solution for the Americans was not simply to throw more firepower at it, but to apply deception, psychology, and strategic positioning. They created situations where the tiger, despite its superiority in firepower, would emerge from its carefully chosen defensive positions into a kill zone meticulously prepared by American forces. The process began with reconnaissance. American infantry and armored units devoted significant time to studying German deployment patterns. Observers recorded the tendencies of tiger crews, which terrain they preferred, how they responded to noise, and what conditions prompted them to fire or reposition. Intelligence officers analyzed battle reports, photographs, and prisoner interrogations to map out tiger behavior. These maps were not just geographic, they were predictive models of operational decision-making, essentially early operational research applied to the battlefield. For instance, American analysts noted that tiger units preferred to stay in reverse slopes or wooded areas when not actively attacking, because open terrain exposed them to artillery or air attacks. If you could make open terrain appear tactically necessary for a German commander, you could manipulate him into leaving cover. This knowledge became the basis for the bait tank concept. A relatively weak armored unit, often a Sherman or a platoon of M10 tank destroyers, would simulate a vulnerable target. The Americans were careful to present this bait in a way that a German observer would recognize as genuine. Tank movement, track patterns, dust clouds, and even radio chatter were crafted to convey the illusion of operational routine. The bait would not simply be an isolated target, it would be reinforced by a narrative. For example, the supposed target might advance slightly beyond the infantry line, simulate artillery calls, or feign a gap in reconnaissance coverage, creating the impression of an opportunity for the German tiger to strike decisively. This manipulation was subtle. The tiger commander had to feel the risk and reward were favorable for engagement. Once the tiger took the bait, the Americans ensured that a kill zone was prepared. Artillery units, pre-registered with precise coordinates, could engage the area within seconds. Anti-tank guns, positioned along likely avenues of approach, remained hidden until the tiger entered their line of fire. In some cases, air support was orchestrated to sweep the target corridor at just the right time. Timing was everything. A tiger emerging too early or too late would have an advantage. Perfectly synchronized firepower guaranteed that the German unit faced an overwhelming combination of threats from multiple directions simultaneously.
The use of terrain was equally sophisticated. American planners selected areas that funneled the tiger into predictable paths. Narrow valleys, ridgelines, and forest clearings were combined to create choke points that the tiger could not avoid without suspicion. In one documented engagement in Normandy, American forces used hedgerow country to channel German armor toward concealed M10 positions. The deceptive movement of bait tanks through these channels encouraged the Tiger to reveal itself, exposing its flank to concentrated fire. Every aspect of the engagement, dust clouds, track imprints, radio chatter, and timing, was calculated to maximize the likelihood of a Tiger committing to the trap. The psychological component was as vital as the physical. Tigers, like all high-performance machines, were operated by humans whose perception of risk could be manipulated. The American forces understood that German tank commanders were trained to seize opportunities aggressively, but were also highly sensitive to perceived threats to their own unit integrity. The bait tanks were presented as low-risk targets, exposed but seemingly supported by infantry or artillery, which paradoxically reassured the German commander that the engagement would not endanger his own unit. This reassurance lowered the threshold for the Tiger to emerge, turning its natural aggressiveness into a liability. Deception was not a lie, but an engineered confidence game. Communication discipline was another layer. American units ensured that only carefully scripted radio messages were sent and received. Noise in the radio spectrum, false reports of friendly movements, and even controlled flares were used to create a believable operational picture for enemy reconnaissance. These signals had to be consistent with previous observations, because a single contradictory message could alert the Tiger crew to potential manipulation. Deception is fragile. Once suspicion arises, the target is no longer exploitable. Consistency of signals, therefore, was as critical as timing and positioning. The Americans also employed auxiliary deception measures to reinforce the illusion. Dummy vehicles, pyrotechnic signals, and even human actors simulating repair or refueling activity added credibility. A Tiger observing a small Sherman advancing slowly might note accompanying figures at the vehicle, suggesting a routine patrol rather than a premeditated ambush. This layering of real and artificial elements increased the probability that the German commander would make predictable tactical decisions. The more credible the tableau, the more reliably the Tiger would commit to the intended course of action. The execution phase required precision and coordination across multiple units. Once the Tiger took the bait and entered the kill zone, American artillery adjusted fire in real time, guided by forward observers who communicated rapidly via secure lines. Anti-tank guns targeted weak points along the Tiger's side or rear, exploiting the limitations of the German tank's frontal armor. The M10 tank destroyers, which had superior mobility relative to the Tiger, engaged from flanking positions. Even small arms fire from infantry units played a role in creating distractions or masking the origin of heavier firepower. The integration of all these elements transformed a single German tank from a nearly invincible asset into a vulnerable target. The Americans effectively weaponized prediction, turning analysis into firepower. The post-engagement assessment revealed the full effectiveness of the operation. Tigers destroyed in such traps were often taken at a distance, with minimal exposure to the baiting units. Fuel expenditure, artillery usage, and personnel risk were all minimized. Beyond the tactical victory, these operations had broader implications for morale. American infantry and armor crews observed firsthand that disciplined deception and coordinated firepower could neutralize the legendary Tiger, which had previously seemed invincible. This psychological dimension bolstered confidence and reinforced the doctrine of using intelligence and analysis as force multipliers. Several lessons emerge from this practice. First, deception in tank warfare requires careful understanding of enemy psychology and operational tendencies. Second, successful baiting depends on synchronized action across multiple units and branches. Third, environmental manipulation, terrain, visual cues, and auxiliary effects amplifies the effectiveness of the trap. Fourth, communication discipline is vital to maintain the credibility of the bait. And finally, integrating deception into broader tactical and operational planning transforms it from an ad hoc trick into a systematic tool of war.
The bait tank concept also illustrates a broader principle relevant to all forms of deception in World War II. The enemy's perception is the battlefield. Material superiority alone does not guarantee success if the adversary can be manipulated into making costly errors. The Americans recognized that the Tiger's strength was inseparable from the human decisions guiding its deployment. By shaping those decisions, the Americans neutralized technical advantages while minimizing their own exposure. This approach, manipulating perception to create tactical opportunity, would recur in subsequent operations, whether in Normandy, the Ardennes, or the Pacific Theater, wherever superior firepower had to contend with cautious or aggressive opponents. Ultimately, the bait tank demonstrates that deception is not merely a defensive or auxiliary measure. It is an offensive instrument capable of shaping enemy behavior. The American experience with the Tiger tank illustrates the meticulous planning, rigorous intelligence gathering, and precise execution required to convert analysis into lethal effect. It is a case study in how operational art, human psychology, and technological understanding can intersect to produce outcomes disproportionate to the material means employed. Part 4. Echoes in the Air: How Allied Radio Noise Manipulated German Radar Interpretation. In the vast theater of World War II, the sky was as much a battlefield as the ground or sea. Air defense systems evolved rapidly, and by 1943, German radar networks stretched across the Western Front, designed to detect approaching bombers and coordinate defensive responses. The Allies recognized that victory in the air depended not only on raw aircraft numbers or superior pilot skill, but also on the manipulation of perception. If radar operators could be misled about the location, size, or composition of incoming forces, entire missions could succeed with minimal casualties, while overestimating or misjudging threats could paralyze the enemy's response. German radar in this period primarily relied on the Freya early warning system and the Würzburg fire control radar. Freya provided long-range detection with a typical range of up to 120 kilometers, while Würzburg offered precise targeting data for anti-aircraft artillery. Both systems were susceptible to electronic interference, and operators required stable signals to interpret airspace correctly. This dependence on signal integrity became a focal point for Allied deception tactics. The United States Air Forces, USAAF, and the Royal Air Force, RAF, collaborated to exploit weaknesses in radar interpretation, creating a multi-layered approach that combined technological ingenuity, operational planning, and psychological exploitation. The Allies developed what was known as window or chaff, thin strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths corresponding to the wavelength of German radar emissions. When released from aircraft over radar detection zones, these strips created massive reflective clouds that appeared as real aircraft on radar screens. The concept was deceptively simple. Saturate the radar system with false echoes so that operators could not distinguish between real bombers and simulated targets. Early tests demonstrated that a single bomber deploying chaff could create a radar signature equivalent to dozens of aircraft. By 1943, operational deployment had evolved into large-scale missions. In one notable operation preceding the bombing of Cologne, hundreds of bombers released tons of chaff to mask their actual approach, resulting in German radar operators reporting phantom formations of striking size. This caused significant confusion and misallocation of defensive fighter units. Beyond chaff, the Allies employed sophisticated electronic countermeasures, ECM. These included jammers that transmitted noise on the same frequencies as German radars, creating artificial echoes or masking real aircraft signatures. Aircraft such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the de Havilland Mosquito were sometimes equipped with early jamming devices, which, though primitive by modern standards, proved highly effective. The Americans coordinated ECM deployment to synchronize with bombing runs, carefully timing the release of jamming signals
to coincide with the critical window when German operators were attempting to calculate interception vectors. The result was a temporary blindness that allowed bombers to approach targets with reduced risk of engagement.
The effectiveness of these measures was enhanced by understanding German decision-making processes. Radar operators did not act in isolation. Their interpretation guided fighter deployment, anti-aircraft artillery targeting, and alert status of airfields. By generating artificial signals, the Allies could influence these decisions indirectly. For example, false signals simulating aircraft approaching from one vector could draw German fighters away from the actual attack corridor. The Allies deliberately studied the timing and response patterns of Luftwaffe controllers, integrating intelligence from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and reconnaissance reports. This allowed for predictive planning, releasing chaff not randomly, but at precise moments calculated to create maximum confusion in operational control centers. Another layer of deception involved the use of decoy formations and simulated bomber streams. Aircraft equipped with small radar reflectors were flown along predetermined routes, creating the illusion of massed formations. Radar operators, seeing these signatures, would often overestimate the number of incoming bombers, reporting phantom threats to command posts. These reports forced German commanders to commit fighters and anti-aircraft resources to areas of minimal strategic importance, effectively diluting their defensive capability. The success of this strategy relied on careful coordination, ensuring that simulated streams were believable and consistent with known flight paths, formation sizes, and operational doctrine. Communication played a pivotal role in reinforcing radar deception. Allied forces occasionally transmitted false radio traffic mimicking operational chatter, such as navigational updates, formation coordination, or mission status reports. German signals intelligence units intercepting these messages integrated them with radar readings, increasing the credibility of the artificial threats. This multi-dimensional approach, combining visual radar manipulation, electronic jamming, and false communications, demonstrated the holistic understanding of operational deception by the Allies. It was not enough to merely confuse one sensor. The deception had to permeate multiple layers of the enemy's decision-making network. The psychological dimension was particularly critical. Radar operators were under immense stress, especially during high-intensity bombing campaigns. False signals exploited cognitive limitations, inducing errors in judgment and increasing response times. In many cases, operators overcompensated, reallocating resources excessively to phantom threats. This phenomenon illustrates a fundamental principle of wartime deception. The enemy's perception, once distorted, can generate disproportionate operational consequences. By exploiting the limitations of human interpretation under stress, the Allies were able to convert abstract noise into tangible strategic advantage. These radar deception tactics also influenced the development of subsequent operations, such as the planning for D-Day. The Normandy invasion required complete mastery of German perception, both on land and in the air. Understanding that radar operators were the first line of detection for coastal defenses, Allied planners incorporated massive electronic and visual deception campaigns, including simulated invasion fleets, dummy landing craft, and coordinated radio traffic. By controlling what the enemy saw and believed, the Allies shaped German operational decisions before the first soldier landed on the beaches. The foundation of these strategies was the same as in the earlier bombing campaigns, exploiting technological and psychological vulnerabilities to manipulate decision-making. Moreover, the Allies refined their approach through iterative feedback. Each mission provided data on the effectiveness of chaff patterns, jamming techniques, and decoy operations. Analysts meticulously recorded how radar operators reacted to different stimuli, creating predictive models that informed future deployments. This systematic refinement ensured that deception tactics remained adaptive and increasingly sophisticated over time. The cumulative effect was a force multiplier. Fewer aircraft could achieve objectives with reduced risk, while the German defense system became progressively overextended and error-prone. Importantly, the success of radar manipulation depended on integration with broader strategic objectives. Deception was never employed arbitrarily. It was synchronized with actual bombing schedules, reconnaissance operations, and operational priorities. By embedding electronic and perceptual deception within the framework of campaign planning, the Allies ensured that the effects of misled radar operators translated directly into mission success. This demonstrates a key aspect of World War II operational art, the deliberate orchestration of information, technology, and human perception to achieve strategic ends. In conclusion, Allied manipulation of German radar networks illustrates the transformative power of perception in modern warfare. By combining chaff, electronic jamming, decoy formations, and false communications, the United States and its allies were able to induce errors in enemy interpretation, divert resources, and achieve tactical and operational advantage with minimal risk. The campaign against German radar was not merely a technical challenge, but a complex interplay of human psychology, technological understanding, and strategic planning. It exemplifies how deception became an integral component of World War II operations, shaping outcomes far beyond the immediate battlefield and reinforcing the principle that victory often depends as much on the enemy's beliefs as on one's own material strength. Part 5. The Illusion Fleet, False Minefields, Phantom Convoys, and Fake Torpedoes in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic during World War II was not just a body of water, but a vast, dynamic chessboard where the United States Navy and its allies fought an invisible war against German U-boats and surface raiders. Unlike conventional naval battles, many of the most decisive encounters were shaped not by gunfire alone, but by information manipulation and strategic deception. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of this was the deployment of illusion fleets, coordinated efforts involving false minefields, phantom convoys, and fake torpedoes designed to mislead the Kriegsmarine, expend enemy resources, and protect critical shipping lanes. This was a war fought as much in the mind of the adversary as in the waves of the Atlantic. The strategic rationale for such deception was straightforward. German U-boats operated under strict fuel, time, and communication constraints. Every patrol involved extensive planning, and every attack required careful positioning. By creating false indicators of Allied presence or defensive arrangements, the Americans could manipulate U-boat behavior without firing a shot. Consider the psychological impact of a false minefield. Mines, once detected or suspected, forced enemy vessels to alter their courses, often dramatically. This rerouting consumed fuel and delayed operations, sometimes preventing attacks on convoys altogether. The Allies capitalized on this principle by deploying dummy markers, broadcasting false warnings, and planting reconnaissance cues that suggested heavily mined areas even where no mines existed. Creating these illusions was both an art and a science. False minefields required careful placement of buoys, decoy magnetic signatures, and even inert mines that mimic the acoustic or magnetic response of active ordnance. The objective was to make German reconnaissance, either by aerial observation or by hydrophone detection, believe the field was real. For example, in the approaches to the British Isles, the U.S. Navy coordinated with Royal Navy units to simulate mine deployment from multiple angles, producing overlapping signals. To a German observer, these cues created the impression of a comprehensive defensive barrier, forcing U-boats to take longer, more predictable routes. These artificial constraints simplified interception and reduced the likelihood of unobserved attacks on convoys. Phantom convoys were another critical component. The U.S. Navy employed small groups of vessels, sometimes including tugboats and fishing craft, outfitted with dummy radar reflectors and other signature-enhancing devices to simulate the movement of large convoys. Radio transmissions were carefully orchestrated to imitate the complex chatter of actual convoys, including navigational updates, distress signals, and routine coordination messages. German radio intercept teams would detect these signals and report them as genuine targets. The result was a redistribution of U-boat patrols toward areas devoid of Allied shipping, effectively diluting the effectiveness of the enemy's operational planning. In one documented instance, German U-boats spent nearly a week tracking a phantom convoy before discovering the deception, while actual convoys passed safely through alternative channels. The use of fake torpedoes, though less common, demonstrated the American understanding of enemy psychology. Early in the war, German U-boat commanders were acutely aware of the capabilities and range of their own weapons, as well as those of Allied escorts. By deploying inert torpedoes or generating acoustic signatures that mimicked torpedo launches, American forces could provoke defensive reactions, such as evasive maneuvers or preemptive counterattacks. These maneuvers, while seeming minor, disrupted operational discipline and forced the U-boats into positions where they could be detected and engaged. Essentially, the Americans weaponized the enemy's expectation. By presenting a false threat, they induced predictable behavior that increased vulnerability.
The coordination required for such deception was significant. Multiple naval and air units had to synchronize movements to maintain the illusion of scale and coherence. Reconnaissance planes would fly predictable patrol paths to reinforce the presence of phantom convoys. Surface vessels would simulate escort formations with precise spacing and timing. Even weather and ocean conditions were considered. For example, deployments were adjusted based on fog, wave height, and visibility to maximize realism. The effectiveness of these illusions depended on the integration of multiple sensory inputs: radar, hydrophone, visual observation, and radio signal. By controlling these variables, the Americans could create a multi-layered perceptual environment that appeared authentic to enemy observers. One of the most illustrative examples of illusion fleet operations occurred in early 1944 as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord. The U.S. Navy, in coordination with the Royal Navy, simulated a large convoy heading toward Norway, complete with escorting destroyers and patrol aircraft. German reconnaissance flights detected these movements and reported them through command channels. In response, several U-boats were dispatched to intercept the perceived threat, leaving the English Channel and the Normandy coast with reduced surveillance coverage. The real invasion convoys later moved through lightly monitored sectors, achieving surprise and minimizing losses. This operation exemplifies the principle that deception is not merely tactical, but can shape strategic outcomes when carefully integrated with broader operational objectives. Moreover, the Allies refined these tactics iteratively. Data from intercepted German communications, captured officers, and post-mission reports informed adjustments in timing, scale, and composition of deception operations. Analysts calculated the optimal size and composition of phantom convoys, the ideal spacing of dummy minefields, and the timing of radio transmissions to maximize enemy confusion. Each iteration increased efficiency, reducing the risk to real assets while expanding the operational impact of the deception. By 1944, the United States had developed a sophisticated doctrine in which the illusion fleet was an integral part of anti-submarine warfare strategy rather than an ad hoc measure. The psychological impact of these operations cannot be overstated. U-boat commanders were forced to allocate resources based on perception rather than reality, leading to operational inefficiency, wasted fuel, and missed opportunities. The constant threat of phantom mines and decoy convoys heightened stress, increased error rates, and reduced morale. In essence, the illusion fleet weaponized human cognition. By shaping what the enemy believed to be true, the Americans influenced decisions, creating conditions where mistakes became inevitable. It is a vivid demonstration of Sun Tzu's principle: all warfare is based on deception. The success of illusion fleet operations relied on meticulous attention to detail. Every element, from the placement of decoys to the timing of radio messages, was calibrated to maintain credibility. Human factors were central. Observers were aware of typical patterns of convoy movement, so any deviation could expose the ruse. Analysts studied enemy reconnaissance methods to anticipate how information would be collected, interpreted, and acted upon. This integration of technical, operational, and psychological considerations represents a holistic approach to warfare, in which information itself becomes a weapon capable of shaping the battlefield without a single direct engagement. In conclusion, the illusion fleet demonstrates the evolution of naval warfare from purely kinetic engagements to complex information operations. False minefields, phantom convoys, and simulated torpedoes served not only to protect Allied shipping, but also to exploit enemy expectations and decision-making processes. By controlling perception across multiple dimensions, acoustic, visual, electronic, and informational, the United States Navy achieved outcomes that would have been impossible through firepower alone. These operations exemplify the art of deception at scale, illustrating how thoughtful integration of technology, intelligence, and human psychology can multiply effectiveness, conserve resources, and decisively influence the course of war.
Part 6. Shadowfile. How American counterintelligence flooded German engineering with fake weapons data. World War II was not only fought on fields, in skies, and across oceans. It was also fought in laboratories, workshops, and offices, where engineers, scientists, and technicians labored under immense pressure. Every technological advantage counted, from the development of faster aircraft to more effective artillery shells, and ultimately to the so-called wonder weapons, advanced projects that could shift the balance of power. Recognizing the critical role of German engineering effort, American counterintelligence developed an extraordinary method of strategic deception: the creation and dissemination of shadow file, falsified technical documents, blueprints, and research reports designed to mislead German engineers, divert resources, and slow the progress of enemy weapon development. The concept was deceptively simple, but operationally complex. The United States, in coordination with British intelligence, identified key areas of German technological research: jet propulsion, rocketry, armor design, and experimental firearms, where delays or misallocation of resources could yield disproportionate operational advantages. Once identified, the Allies crafted falsified documents that appeared authentic, often incorporating partially accurate technical information mixed with deliberate errors, misleading assumptions, or instructions that would result in wasted effort if acted upon. These shadow files were then transmitted through channels that German intelligence was likely to intercept: double agents, neutral intermediaries, and carefully staged espionage operations. One of the most effective methods involved manipulating German trust in their own intelligence network. German engineers relied on a steady flow of intelligence from espionage sources to validate project decisions and prioritize development. By introducing falsified data that appeared to come from these sources, American counterintelligence was able to make the Germans question the reliability of their own measurements and calculations. For example, in the domain of tank development, engineers might receive reports suggesting that a new type of Allied armor could resist high-velocity projectiles. Based on this false premise, design priorities would shift toward unnecessary enhancements, delaying production schedules and diverting critical resources such as steel, manpower, and manufacturing capacity. The strategic logic behind shadow files was rooted in the economics of wartime production. German industry, already under significant strain from Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not afford misallocated effort. Every week spent developing unnecessary modifications represented a tangible reduction in combat readiness. American counterintelligence recognized that the most effective deception was not the outright destruction of enemy assets, but the manipulation of enemy effort, forcing engineers and managers to invest in false solutions. In some cases, entire experimental projects were launched or prolonged based on falsified specifications, producing results that consumed raw materials while generating no operational advantage. Implementation required meticulous attention to detail. Falsified blueprints were crafted to match the stylistic conventions and technical language familiar to German engineers. Metric dimensions, material specifications, and manufacturing tolerances were carefully calibrated to appear plausible. Even typographical nuance and aging techniques were employed to enhance authenticity. Counterintelligence operatives understood that German skepticism was high. A poorly forged document would be dismissed and the opportunity for deception lost. Only those files that could survive scrutiny by experienced engineers and technicians were considered effective. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of the human element in technical decision-making. Deception is not about fooling a computer or a formula, but about influencing the judgment of experts under operational stress. One notable example of shadow file operations targeted the German V-1 and V-2 rocket programs. The Allies were aware that these programs represented significant potential threats to London and other strategic targets. Through controlled leaks and intercepted communications, false engineering reports suggested that Allied scientists had developed countermeasures capable of neutralizing certain guidance systems or propulsion methods. German engineers, uncertain about the veracity of these reports, but unwilling to risk operational failure, devoted time and resources to verifying and countering non-existent threats. Even minimal delays in such programs could have substantial strategic consequences. By the time German rockets were operationally deployed, the Allies had already adapted air defense strategies, mitigated supply lines, or shifted focus to alternate targets.
Shadow files also extended to the German aircraft industry. Allied intelligence identified projects involving jet aircraft, advanced propeller designs, and experimental armaments. Through controlled dissemination of falsified technical memos, German engineers were led to prioritize modifications that were unnecessary or misdirected. In some instances, calculations embedded within the documents contained subtle errors in stress tolerances or aerodynamic coefficients, which, if implemented, would produce aircraft with reduced performance or increased maintenance demands. Even without actual implementation, the time spent analyzing, discussing, and verifying these documents imposed delays. In this way, the Allies weaponized uncertainty itself, transforming suspicion into operational friction. The human psychology underlying shadow file effectiveness was crucial. Engineers, particularly under wartime pressure, are trained to verify, calculate, and cross-check. Introducing false but plausible data exploits cognitive tendencies such as confirmation bias, risk aversion, and the desire to preempt enemy advantage. When a German engineer received a shadow file suggesting an imminent technological threat, the rational response was to investigate, simulate, and prepare a countermeasure. That response, though rational from an individual perspective, was exactly what the Allies intended. It consumed time, energy, and material resources while producing no genuine operational gain for the Germans. In essence, the deception converted mental effort into strategic advantage. Operational security measures were integral to shadow file dissemination. Documents were routed through agents who had credibility with German intelligence. Some were double agents, deliberately cultivated over months, whose reports were trusted because they had previously provided accurate information. Others were planted in neutral territories, where German espionage networks had known access. The goal was to ensure that the documents would be intercepted naturally, without raising suspicion about their origin. The process mirrors modern-day influence operations. Success depends not on the content alone, but on the credibility and context of the delivery channel. The cumulative effect of shadow files was measurable. Even modest delays in German weapons development had cascading operational consequences. Tanks, aircraft, and rockets that could have been deployed weeks or months earlier arrived later, sometimes too late to influence specific campaigns. Engineers wasted materials on unnecessary prototypes or tested modifications with no strategic impact. Meanwhile, the Allies gained valuable time to prepare operations, mass forces, and develop countermeasures. In strategic terms, the flood of falsified technical data acted as a force multiplier, achieving effects disproportionate to the relatively low cost of document fabrication and dissemination. Shadow files also illustrate a broader principle of deception in World War II. It is as much about manipulating decisions and priorities as it is about physical destruction. By controlling what the enemy believes about their own technological capabilities, counterintelligence can shape operational outcomes without firing a single shot. The combination of technical authenticity, human psychology, and operational integration is what made these operations particularly effective. They were deliberate, systematic, and tailored to exploit the vulnerabilities of German engineering culture, which prized precision and careful calculation, but was vulnerable to carefully crafted misinformation. In conclusion, the American use of shadow files demonstrates the strategic power of information warfare. By flooding German engineering and research efforts with falsified technical data, the Allies slowed weapon development, misdirected resources, and created operational advantages across multiple theaters of war. These operations highlight that victory in modern conflict often depends as much on shaping the enemy's perception and priorities as on direct combat. Shadow files exemplify the sophisticated integration of technical knowledge, psychological insight, and strategic planning that characterized American deception efforts during World War II. They transformed laboratories and offices into contested domains, proving that the battlefield extends far beyond the front lines and that deception, when carefully executed, can yield effects as decisive as any artillery barrage or naval engagement. Part 7. Phantom Artillery. How American forces deceived German spotters with false fire patterns and dummy batteries. Artillery has long been a decisive factor in warfare, and during World War II, it became a central instrument in both offense and defense. The German Wehrmacht prided itself on precision artillery coordination, relying heavily on forward observers and spotters to direct fire against advancing troops, armored columns, and logistical targets. In response, American forces developed sophisticated deception tactics designed to mislead German observers about both the presence and strength of artillery units. These operations, collectively referred to as Phantom Artillery initiatives, exploited the limitations of visual and auditory intelligence, creating illusions that caused the enemy to misallocate fire, hesitate in attacks, or avoid otherwise advantageous terrain. The results were often dramatic, saving lives, conserving resources, and shaping battles without the direct application of lethal force. The principle behind phantom artillery was deceptively simple. If German spotters believed an artillery emplacement existed, they would act accordingly, regardless of whether the guns were real. The Americans employed multiple methods to create these illusions. One of the most common was the use of dummy artillery pieces. These were constructed from wood, canvas, and steel, designed to mimic the silhouette, size, and profile of actual howitzers or field guns. From aerial reconnaissance, these dummies appeared indistinguishable from functioning weapons. Furthermore, they were often placed in realistic emplacements, complete with camouflage netting, dug-in earthworks, and support structures such as ammunition crates or sandbag revetments. The effect was a convincing replication of a functioning battery that could fool both aerial photography and ground observation. Auditory deception complemented visual tactics. Sound projection techniques, sometimes employing concealed loudspeakers or mechanical devices, simulated the firing of artillery. In some cases, recording devices captured the sound of live fire, which could then be played in proximity to dummy batteries during critical moments. For German observers, who often relied on triangulation of sound and visual confirmation to estimate enemy strength, this combination of auditory and visual cues created a highly persuasive illusion. Phantom batteries could therefore fire upon targets, provoke counter-battery action, or generate the perception of defensive coverage in areas where no real guns existed. Timing and positioning were critical to the success of phantom artillery operations. American engineers and intelligence officers studied German reconnaissance schedules, understanding when spotters would be active, what lines of sight they would use, and how quickly they could transmit observations. Dummy batteries were deployed along avenues of observation likely to be scanned, and auditory deception was coordinated with anticipated observation windows. In some instances, deception units were moved periodically to simulate the repositioning of artillery, reinforcing the impression of an active, responsive force. This required careful planning and logistical coordination, as dummy batteries had to appear both credible and operationally coherent. Phantom artillery also included the deliberate creation of false firing patterns. In preparation for attacks, American forces would simulate concentrations of fire in areas away from actual points of engagement. Smoke generators, pyrotechnics, and controlled detonations produced visual and auditory effects consistent with bombardment. German spotters, interpreting these cues, would report the presence of active batteries and adjust their own artillery plans accordingly. In some instances, they would divert fire to non-existent targets or hesitate to advance through areas believed to be under heavy fire, achieving operational advantage without a single live round being expended on the enemy. The psychological effect of these illusions often exceeded the physical, shaping enemy behavior and buying time for troop movements and logistical operations. Integration with broader operational planning amplified the impact of phantom artillery. Deception was synchronized with infantry maneuvers, armored advances, and air support. For example, during the Normandy campaign, dummy batteries were used to suggest concentrations of artillery in areas distant from the actual landing beaches. German commanders, relying on these reports, misallocated their own artillery units and delayed counterattacks. By coordinating multiple sensory cues, visual, auditory, and radio signals, the Americans created a multi-dimensional illusion that could withstand scrutiny for hours or even days. This level of sophistication illustrates the holistic approach to deception that characterized American operations. Success required not only the creation of false indicators, but also their integration into the enemy's decision-making framework.
Another key aspect was the adaptation and feedback loop. After engagements, intelligence officers analyzed German response patterns, assessing how effectively the Phantom artillery misled spotters and altered enemy actions. Adjustments were made to improve credibility, such as refining the construction of dummy guns, modifying sound projection techniques, or repositioning installations based on observed lines of sight. This iterative approach ensured that deception operations evolved in sophistication and effectiveness over time, continually increasing the operational value of resources devoted to illusionary artillery. The human dimension was central to the effectiveness of Phantom artillery. German spotters, operating under stress and with incomplete information, were prone to cognitive biases such as overestimation of threat and confirmation bias. By presenting cues consistent with enemy expectations, American deception units exploited these tendencies. For example, if a German observer expected an American battery to be present along a ridgeline, the appearance of dummy guns there reinforced prior belief, making it more likely that reports would treat the decoys as real. In other words, the Allies weaponized expectation, turning psychological predisposition into a tangible operational tool. Phantom artillery operations were not limited to defensive scenarios. They were also used offensively to manipulate battlefield geometry. By creating the perception of concentrated artillery in a given area, Americans could funnel German units into kill zones, mask true attack vectors, or create diversions that enabled successful assaults elsewhere. This strategic flexibility underscores the utility of deception. It was not merely a protective measure, but an offensive instrument capable of shaping enemy behavior, dispersing resources, and creating exploitable vulnerabilities. Quantitative assessments further highlight the effectiveness of these operations. While exact figures are often difficult to verify, documented engagements demonstrate that entire enemy regiments were sometimes delayed, diverted, or neutralized by false indications of artillery strength. In Normandy, for instance, decoy batteries played a critical role in absorbing attention and fire from German units that might otherwise have engaged landing forces directly. Similarly, in the Ardennes, Phantom artillery helped obscure the concentration of American and Allied forces, complicating German planning and reducing the efficacy of counteroffensives. Across multiple theaters, the consistent theme is that well-executed deception can yield results disproportionate to the material resources expended. Phantom artillery also reflects the broader evolution of American operational art during World War II. Traditional military doctrine emphasized firepower, mobility, and terrain advantage, but the Americans increasingly recognized that shaping enemy perception could achieve equivalent or greater effects. By integrating technical ingenuity, psychological insight, and careful observation of enemy behavior, deception operations transformed static or predictable engagements into dynamic, controllable scenarios. The lesson is clear. Mastery of perception and information can magnify the effectiveness of even limited material assets, creating strategic leverage across time and space. In conclusion, the use of Phantom artillery demonstrates the sophistication, creativity, and systemic planning characteristic of American deception efforts. By combining dummy emplacements, auditory illusions, false firing patterns, and integrated operational coordination,
The Allies were able to manipulate German observation and response, achieve tactical and operational advantage, and save lives and resources. Phantom artillery is a striking example of how information, perception, and psychological insight were weaponized during World War II, proving that the battlefield extended far beyond the reach of guns and shells into the realm of human cognition and expectation. Part 8. Operation Shadow Strike: Coordinated Deception Across Land, Sea, and Air. The culmination of American deception operations during World War II was the orchestration of multi-domain campaigns, combining lessons learned from prior successes in naval, aerial, and ground operations. Operation Shadow Strike, a term encompassing a series of coordinated initiatives in late 1944 and 1945, exemplifies the apex of this approach. Unlike isolated instances of trickery, Shadow Strike integrated deception across all theaters, synchronizing intelligence, technological countermeasures, and psychological manipulation to produce outcomes far exceeding the impact of conventional force alone. This operation illustrates the principle that when deception is treated as a strategic tool, its effects resonate across multiple layers of the battlefield, shaping enemy behavior, dispersing resources, and creating exploitable vulnerabilities.
At its core, Operation Shadow Strike relied on a systematic understanding of German command and control processes. The Germans maintained a complex network of observation posts, radio relay centers, and intelligence units tasked with monitoring Allied movements. Every unit, from frontline divisions to headquarters staff, depended on consistent, credible data to make operational decisions. Recognizing this, the Americans designed a multi-tiered deception plan that injected false or misleading information into all relevant channels. Techniques varied according to domain. In the air, chaff clouds, jamming, and phantom bomber streams confused radar operators. At sea, dummy convoys and simulated minefields disrupted U-boat patrols. On land, dummy artillery, decoy tanks, and misdirected infantry movements shaped perceptions of force disposition. A central component was the coordination of timing across all domains. Deception was most effective when multiple stimuli occurred simultaneously, creating a composite perception of threat. For instance, a false convoy in the North Atlantic might coincide with radar interference over continental Europe, suggesting that an amphibious operation was imminent along a specific coast. At the same time, dummy armored movements inland could reinforce the illusion of an impending offensive. German commanders, confronted with this coherent but fabricated narrative, faced a difficult dilemma: commit forces to counter perceived threats, potentially leaving real Allied operations unopposed, or delay action and risk surprise. Shadow Strike leveraged this uncertainty, turning enemy decision-making into a strategic advantage. Naval operations played a pivotal role. By 1944, the United States Navy had perfected the use of dummy vessels, false radio transmissions, and simulated torpedo attacks to manipulate German perception. These tactics were amplified during Shadow Strike, with phantom convoys positioned to suggest major invasions along multiple fronts. U-boat deployments were diverted to these non-existent threats, while actual troop and supply movements passed largely undetected. Allied commanders exploited the predictable behavior induced by deception, channeling enemy submarines into prearranged kill zones or away from strategic shipping lanes entirely. This multi-layered manipulation exemplifies the principle that deception can produce force multiplication. A smaller number of vessels can achieve effects disproportionate to their size through control of the adversary's perceptions. Airborne elements were similarly sophisticated. Radar jamming, chaff clouds, and simulated bomber formations were deployed in synchronized patterns, creating phantom threats that masked real operations. For example, during the planning of the Rhine crossings, American and British forces executed simultaneous electronic countermeasures over multiple sectors. German radar operators detected what appeared to be massed formations moving toward different sectors, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse fighter coverage and weakening defensive concentration. In addition, radio transmissions and false communications reinforced these illusions, creating a highly credible operational picture that dictated enemy responses. The result was a substantial reduction in anti-aircraft engagement on actual troop movements,
contributing directly to the success of airborne landings and supply drops. On land, deception units employed a combination of dummy armor, fake artillery, and simulated troop movements to mislead German observers. These efforts were informed by extensive reconnaissance and understanding of enemy expectations. Terrain was carefully selected to maximize visibility to observers without risking detection of real units. Dummy tanks, complete with camouflage and track imprints, were positioned along anticipated lines of sight. Artillery batteries, sometimes augmented by sound projection to simulate firing, created the illusion of substantial defensive or offensive capability. These measures were timed to coincide with actual operations, creating a layered narrative in which German commanders perceived threats that did not exist, while failing to identify real concentrations of Allied forces. A critical aspect of Shadow Strike was the use of intelligence analysis to anticipate German responses. The Americans leveraged captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and signal intercepts to model likely enemy behavior under different scenarios. This predictive approach allowed deception operations to be proactive rather than reactive. For instance, the release of chaff over radar sectors was scheduled based on known Luftwaffe patrol routines. Phantom convoys were positioned to intersect likely U-boat patrol areas at precise intervals. Dummy armor and artillery were emplaced where German observers were most likely to report activity to higher command. This level of planning reflects a sophisticated understanding of the enemy as a system, where misinformation could cascade through operational structures to produce tangible advantages.
The psychological dimension remained paramount. Deception operations relied on shaping German perceptions in a way that induced predictable decisions. By creating a believable but false operational environment, Shadow Strike forced enemy commanders to commit forces prematurely, disperse defenses, or hesitate in critical moments. This manipulation exploited the cognitive limitations inherent in complex wartime decision-making. Uncertainty, stress, and incomplete information all heightened susceptibility to deception. Even small misperceptions could have disproportionate effects when amplified across multiple units and theaters, illustrating the strategic power of coordinated information warfare. Evaluation and adaptation were integral components of the operation. Following each engagement, intelligence officers analyzed the effectiveness of visual, auditory, and electronic deception methods. German response patterns were studied to refine the timing, placement, and sophistication of subsequent operations. Lessons learned were rapidly integrated, creating an iterative cycle in which deception methods evolved to meet changing conditions and adversary adaptations. This continuous improvement ensured that Shadow Strike remained credible and effective even as German forces became more cautious and sophisticated in their counterintelligence efforts. The operational results of Shadow Strike were significant. Across multiple theaters, German units were misdirected, resources misallocated, and operational momentum disrupted. Naval assets were drawn away from actual convoy routes, reducing losses and preserving critical supply lines. Air defenses were misapplied, facilitating successful airborne and bombing operations. On land, dummy units and false artillery reduced the effectiveness of enemy fire and delayed counterattacks. Beyond tangible results, the operation also had profound effects on morale and decision-making. German commanders, repeatedly misled by coherent yet false operational patterns, faced increased uncertainty, slowed responses, and diminished confidence in their intelligence networks. In contrast, Allied forces gained confidence in the utility of deception, reinforcing its role as a core element of operational planning. Shadow Strike exemplifies the synthesis of prior American deception tactics. Lessons from the bait tank operations, radar manipulation, illusion fleets, shadow files, and phantom artillery were integrated into a comprehensive framework, demonstrating that deception is most powerful when treated as a strategic instrument rather than a tactical afterthought. Each domain, land, sea, air, and information, contributed to a unified narrative that guided enemy behavior, illustrating that victory in complex modern warfare requires control over perception as much as control over territory or materiel. In conclusion, Operation Shadow Strike represents the apex of American deception in World War II. By coordinating multi-domain operations that combined visual, auditory, and electronic cues,
The Allies manipulated German perception to achieve strategic and operational advantage. The operation underscores the principle that war is fought as much in the mind of the adversary as on the battlefield itself. Through careful planning, technological innovation, psychological insight, and iterative refinement, the United States demonstrated that deception could shape outcomes across multiple theaters, multiplying effectiveness, conserving resources, and reducing casualties. Shadow Strike serves as a lasting testament to the art and science of deception, highlighting its central role in modern military strategy and its decisive impact on the course of World War II. Course of World War II. Course of World War II. Course of World War II.